Yeah, so Trey Hendrickson, New Orleans on Football has a great article, What to Do with Trey Hendrickson right now. And it is an intriguing question, right? Because Trey Hendrickson is, he's created that always impossible question to answer where during a money year in which free agency was coming up, he exceeded expectations and then some. Like he showed you something that he has never shown before. And now the question becomes, is that success really representative of who he is and who he will continue to become? Remember, this is a very young pass rusher in Trey Hendrickson, or is it fluky, right? And that's where it becomes a bit tough to discern, right? Because, you know, the film shows that it wasn't totally fluky. Like he was winning these one-on-ones consistently, but there were still elements that maybe say that it was. Also, my brain just kind of refuses to accept that it's not fluky because all of a sudden you had Trey Hendrickson up there with Aaron Donald, tied for 13 and a half sacks, second in the NFL. So really the main problem here is that the Saints are having to answer this question at the time that Trey Hendrickson is hitting his peak, his zenith of his career thus far. He had no sacks 2 years ago, 4.5 sacks last year, 13.5 sacks this year. How do you take that? Is that a guy who has shown consistent growth and success? Well, absolutely. In one way it is. From 0 to 4.5 to 13.5 speaks to someone who is learning the ropes, who is continuing to improve technique. In fact, technique is really where Trey Hendrickson shines, given that he's outperformed a guy like Marcus Davenport, who is infinitely more physically talented, but has not had the production. So where is the truth of Trey Hendrickson? And like all other things, the truth of Trey Hendrickson is probably somewhere in the middle. Maybe I end up being wrong here. To me, he feels like a 5, 6, 7 sacks a year type of guy, which is a solid player. Like that's somebody who you want on the squad. There is value there, but it's not that Frank Clark value that we talked about going into the commercial break. It's not that $104 million value that Frank Clark got for getting 13 sacks for Seattle back in 2018. And look, I think right now the Saints' finances are so tight that I don't know that they have the luxury of keeping up, or even that they would want to, even if it wasn't tight, and keeping up with a Trey Hendrickson bidding war if he commands that sort of money. And that's what's going to be also intriguing to me. Is there a team out there that feels like they're close, that maybe Trey Hendrickson puts them over the top? Because I do feel comfortable in saying this, okay? And I don't think I'm wrong here, but I do think that Trey Hendrickson is a bit of a peerless price in Buffalo specifically. And I know, I don't know why. I'm sure there are better metaphors and analogies, and I'm sure there are younger listeners out there like, who's Peerless Price? He's a beast at Tennessee back in the day. Then he goes to Buffalo, and he was really good in Buffalo, really good, 1,000-yard receiver. But you know what he was? He was the number 2. He was the number 2 to Eric Moulds. Well, but he was so good. Surely he can be a number 1, right? The Falcons take him in to be the number 1. He never ends up getting it done. Why? Because he no longer had Eric Moulds taking the attention away from him. I'm worried that that's what Trey Hendrickson is. I don't think he's a number 1. Nick, in the New Orleans on Football article, does have some interesting numbers that are a little more granular if you want to get into them, about his lack of success against double teams, which would point to this idea that, right, he's great one-on-one, but when the defense does focus on him and commit resources to him, when they chip him, etc., does he open things up from teammates? Can he beat the double teams consistently? And I don't believe the answer. I think the answer is no. And so he's a bit like Peerless Price. And you can't commit to Peerless Price the money that you would to a true number 1. So sure, if Trey Hendrickson remains affordable, pay him as a number 2 pass rusher. Absolutely. He deserves that money. I think he will reward you for that money. I do not think you should give him primetime premier pass rusher money. And I don't know, look, I don't know that other teams will be willing to do so too, right? Maybe they will when you look at the stats, because the stats are pretty gaudy this year with the 13.5 sack explosion. But it'll be an interesting market to watch from here on out. I guess the bottom line of this conversation is just to establish that although he was very good last year, I don't know that I would give him that number 1 money. There needs to be a limit to what you would pay him. Now, if I wanted to argue the other side, though, and argue against myself, there's a chance that I'm way off here because he was by far the most efficient pass rusher in the NFL out of the big names, and it's not even particularly close. How about this? TJ Watt had TJ Watt had 452 pass rushes, okay? 452. He ended up with 15 sacks. Aaron Donald had 606 pass rush attempts. He ends up with 13.5 sacks. Zadarius Smith, 517 pass rush attempts, 12.5 sacks. Trey Hendrickson had 13.5 on only 348 attempts. So you're looking at 100 less than TJ Watt and yet just a sack and a half less. 250 less attempts than Aaron Donald and yet the same amount of sacks. So there is a there's a world here where I'm completely wrong, and this is his trajectory, and he becomes that true number one. I just don't think, unfortunately, as a byproduct of the Saints' tough cap situation right now, I don't think that you can commit to that world. And if you lose out on him, it's a huge bummer. And maybe if he goes on to do great things, it's an even bigger bummer. In hindsight, 2020, and maybe you end up blaming the front office for it. You should have known. But I think if we're being fully objective right now, I don't think many of you would be willing to commit number one money to Trey Hendrickson. Danny, has this changed your mind at all? Would you give number one pass rush option money to Trey Hendrickson?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think he deserves like second tier money. But the thing that I don't like is Davenport's always injured, and
yeah,
that's why I kind of want to keep Hendrickson, because Davenport's constantly getting injured.
Yeah, and Davenport hasn't been nearly as productive. I mean, the Saints got better when he entered the lineup for sure, and he had his moments, but I had higher hopes for him, and he has not come through on those hopes, and especially always Davenport's going to have to deal with the burden of expectation that's levied on him just by the price that you gave up to get him. But you know what? Look, those are our opinions. Let's get the real expert opinion. Let's go to Jeff Duncan next here on OTBOT, and he can try to answer our Trey Hendrickson conundrums as well as Chris Richard and what he thinks of that hire, and whether or not he thinks that Musa should come watch Fellowship of the Ring and IMAX with me on OTBOT.